Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. So let's move into local news and automation, which was a story that appeared in Friday in the newsletter, and it's kind of a fascinating story to me. It kind of comes off of the Gannett layoffs story last week, or over a period of weeks. Actually, they laid off 400 people, some of whom are sort of back of the house, if you will, and some of whom are probably journalists, although those numbers weren't broken out. But what it reflects is kind of a metaphor, an instance of the larger problem of local news journalists disappearing, local news not, sort of withering. And there are all kinds of societal implications from that, which we don't need to talk about at length in terms of the cohesion of communities and just access to information. But here, to the rescue comes automation. So it's a very kind of mixed blessing, I think. You've got all these sort of AI content creation tools now. Some of them are already being used in a news context. They'll be used more broadly in the future. There's a big AP report on that. And it'll be interesting to see what kinds of stories and how pervasively we get AI content creation for local news. I think it's going to be pretty widespread in the future because it's a way to deliver local news without many humans being involved. I mean, you'll need some human for some kind of editing or oversight, but I think it'll just be an excuse for these corporate-owned companies, many of whom now are private equity-owned, ultimately, to purge staff or to not hire new people or to do local news on the cheap. And then there's the question of how does that play out in terms of Google and its so-called helpful content update and prohibitions against automated content. That'll be interesting to see that, because I think that's the direction it's going, with certain maybe prominent exceptions. LA Times and maybe certain major metro dailies will still have meaningful local reporting. I don't know.
The major metro dailies that have reached a national and international audience.
Right.
New York Times, Guardian, Washington Post, LA Times, Seattle Times. There aren't that many.
There are less than 10 of them probably in the country.
Right.
Yeah. So this is the half full version is that this is a way to deliver local news at a time when it's disappearing. The half empty version is this is going to compromise quality. It's going to lead to weirdness, and it's just a further lamentable development in this decline of news and journalism over time at the hands of the internet.
Newsageddon.
Yes, newsageddon. We just need to find as many of these. We can append the geddon suffix or apocalypse suffix to everything we talk about.
There you go. That's our theme this week.
So nobody disagrees with anything that I said?
No, I have a lot to say. I was waiting for you.
Okay, you were politely waiting. Okay, unleash it.
It's an interesting development. I'm not going to necessarily comment on Gannett specifically, but obviously the erosion of local news.
I have a question though. Do we have an obligation to divulge your previous employment by Gannett under requirements?
I was also laid off by Gannett several years ago in a pre-COVID move. So
that is obviously animating your remarks right now, which have an obvious bias.
I harbor no particular ill will towards Gannett. Understand the business decision there.
Just the normal ill will, not a particular one.
Just my generalized ill will toward everyone. Yes. So I was just going to say though, I would say a couple things. First of all, I don't think that the companies that will succeed with AI-generated local news are necessarily traditional media companies themselves today. I actually think they're more likely to be new startups or sort of news-adjacent tech companies that figure out a way to package data and insights and everything else into AI-generated stories. I think it's just a fundamentally different mindset that a traditional media org is just not going to have. And we saw media companies fail miserably, which is one of the reasons that Gannett and others have suffered so much, fail miserably at trying to shift their business models from selling classified ads and display ads in print to selling online marketing and advertising services. Like that's just been a very difficult transition for all of those companies. And you've seen companies for who that don't have this sort of legacy mindset succeed to a much greater extent. I think the same thing is likely to be true here when it comes to AI generated local content. The second piece I would say is something that's near and dear, unfortunately, to my heart, given what's happened recently here in Portland. We highlighted this in one of the little snippets in a recent newsletter, Greg, that I think it was a Cal Berkeley professor had done an analysis of which downtowns had recovered the best post-pandemic. San Francisco was the worst. I can't remember who was second worst, and Portland was third worst. And so that was a really interesting sort of study. There was another story that came out today in our local alt weekly, the Willamette Week, about the incredible downtown vacancy rates and the number of hotels that are filing for bankruptcy and all of this stuff. Really awful story. That to me is one that probably could have been told through AI and should be told in a better way with data visualization and all of that kind of stuff than the Willamette Week told it. It was a very traditional, like, here's what's happening. We're going to interview 3 property owners. Here's our summation. I personally would love to see a map that I could interact with of the vacancy rates. Are they worse in certain neighborhoods or not? Like that's all stuff that AI can and should do a better job of telling actually than a local traditional reporter. So not every story is going to be that way. You don't report on a
local political campaign.
Exactly. Right. You wouldn't do that through AI necessarily, but I do think there's certain stories that actually lend themselves better to an AI sort of data-driven storytelling model that traditional media orgs, I just don't think are going to be the ones that cover.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, which is this kind of hybrid model where you have a human who is taking some sort of initial data or presentation of information from an automated system and then shaping it or adding to it. And so I think that's what some of these experiments currently in these traditional media organizations look like. And that may ultimately be the most useful integration of AI. And I do also agree that there are going to be some new startups that make better use of this than traditional media companies. They could be in verticals, very in niche areas. But Mike, you wanted to say something.
Well, just primarily that I think sports is an interesting area because it's a relatively low-hanging fruit with a fairly standardized format for reporting, at least much of it, and lends itself also to audio, which would lend itself to Google's Assistant and Apple's Siri and other delivery, Amazon speakers delivery system. So to David's point about alternative sort of sideways reporting of local news, I think there's an opportunity that will fall early in this.
Well, that brings up YouTube also, because you go to YouTube to look up some how-to thing or get more information on something you read, and in, let's say, 5 out of 10 cases, just anecdotally, there's some computer-generated voice that's reading a transcript over an animation, something like that.
So right? At some point, we can pick our speaker. I could have Brad Pitt reading me the local sports news as deep fake.
Well, I didn't Alexa do something? Didn't Amazon do something like that where you could have certain celebrity voices that have been licensed? So I mean, I think there's some interesting scenarios here, and we'll see. But it's definitely going to be. We're definitely going to see an evolution of this.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.